Welcome to the Dieku podcast with Gary Snow.
Welcome to the Dieku podcast, episode 3. We are taking probably a welcome departure from me rambling about the city's grim and the game mechanics that I've been working on. And we have a special guest, Chuck Welch, who is an expert, or I would say an expert on Doc Savage. And he is going to share with us a little bit of the history of Doc Savage, the world's first superhero, and I think you'll find it very enlightening and entertaining, and this forgotten hero for many, and hopefully we can just shine a bit of a light on him and the people that brought him to life. So without further ado, here's our interview with Chuck. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by Chuck Welch. With the Hidalgo Trading Company website and the Flea Run discussion group, Chuck has spent a quarter century bringing together fans of the pulp fiction character Doc Savage. When he isn't discussing Doc Savage online, he edits the Bronze Gazette, a magazine devoted to Doc. Pre-COVID, Chuck hosted an annual convention for Doc Savage fans called the Bronze Conversation. In 2020, like many other activities, the conversation was held virtually. He'll tell you that he's not the world's foremost expert on Doc, but he's thrilled to host opportunities for those experts and fans to get together and discuss the fiction they fell in love with. Chuck, welcome, and thank you for joining me today to discuss Doc Savage, the world's first superhero.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. Always a bone of contention with everybody. So thanks for having me here. I have no idea why you want to talk about Doc Savage.
Well, even in my own investigation of, as some of the podcast listeners know, I've been designing a game called The City is Grim. And one of the things that I really wanted to hone in on was this like lead up to World War II era of superheroes. And in my research, I came across Doc Savage, but I'll get to that maybe a little bit later. For those that don't know about Doc Savage, can you tell us a little bit about him?
Sure. I can give you some information, get you enough to where you can start finding out on your own. First and foremost, we're talking about a character from a magazine in the 1930s and 40s. This is the pulp fiction that everybody got confused with the movie when it came out. But at the time, pulp fiction magazines were the prime entertainment before TV and when radio was first starting. So Doc Savage was a product of a magazine firm called Street and Smith. And they had a hero that a lot of people have heard of called the Shadow. And Street and Smith wanted to expand their hero pulp line after their successful start of the Shadow. So in 1932, they created a character, the publisher and the prime editor, Henry Walston and John Nanovic, called Doc Savage. Though rooted in the traditional hero fiction, Doc was a product of a depression. That's the best way you can put it. Doc was a man, only a man, wasn't a guy with superpowers. He didn't have any supernatural abilities. There was nothing unusual about Doc, except he had been raised from birth to be the best that he could be in everything he did. He was the best doctor there was. He was the best engineer there was. If there was a subject that Doc studied, he became the best at it. He was also a prime physical specimen. And the idea of this character was very, very born in the time of the Depression, when people were looking sort of down on themselves, men especially. It's like, I do everything I can and I can't have this wonderful life. Doc was somebody that the kids could emulate. Here was a person who did it all on his own. I mean, he exercised every day. He studied every day. He was a self-made man.
And tell us a little bit just about even the Man of Bronze and his name and how that kind of plays into it.
Sure. Can I read you a little something?
Sure.
So before the magazine started, the Nanovic and Ralston created a novella that was about the character. And I will read you this and let you edit out whatever you don't like later. But I'll just read the beginning of it. The city of New York was shrouded in the deep gloom of a misty evening. The heaviness of the skies bore down upon the tall buildings, seeming to weigh them down under the oppressive atmosphere. Most of the buildings had been emptied of their daily toilers, but there were occasional shrouded eyes of light gleaming from their sides. High up under the eave of one of these chimneys, which New Yorkers called buildings, 6 men were gathered. They were in a beautifully furnished office which overlooked the city through its spacious windows on 2 sides, but their attention was focused on one of their number as he talked. Seated at this massive desk, this man held the 5 companions by his words as much as by his appearance. He was a large man, yet so well put together that the impression one received was not of size, but of power. And the bulk of his body was forgotten in the smooth symmetry of that powerful build. With his back toward one of the huge windows that took up the side of the office, his face was not sharply outlined except when he turned to the right or left to speak directly to his listeners. Then it struck the watcher as a face of most unusual qualities: the high, strong forehead, the strong but not too full mouth, the firm set nose, all denoted character in every line. It was a face that was remarkable from whatever angle it was seen. The skin was of a healthy bronze color, bespeaking of long years spent beneath tropical suns and northern skies, of an active, exhilarating life of a man of action and adventure. His hair, as if made to match that perfectly colored skin, was a deeper bronze and lay back smoothly. Most striking of his features, though, were his eyes. Set well apart, they were like 2 powerful magnets that drew everything into their range. Their color, too, was bronze, a deep bronze color with lights playing up on it so that sometimes the bronze was like a heap of flaky gold glistening in the sun. All right, I'm gonna stop there. The guy was bronze, okay? You're not getting the point out.
Well, and then that kind of leads into my second part of that, is that the character was so influential, and when you look at what was written about him and the tropes of his stories, you can see the influence going forward for up until today. And the Man of Bronze, and then maybe you want to elaborate on some of the copying, like Superman and the Man of Steel.
Like all fictional characters, each generation borrows from the characters before. Doc Savage's name in the books is Clark Savage Jr., and of course, Superman's name is Clark Kent. Doc Savage had a place in the Arctic where he would go to study and to develop new gadgets and to get away from the world. And he called it the Fortress of Solitude. Superman came along later, and guess what he has? A Fortress of Solitude. So Doc had a lot of gadgets that he would use. He would wear a vest, and in that vest were all sorts of gadgets he would use during his, adventures. And, Batman, of course, had his utility belt and all his many whatever they were called, his bat gadgets.
Batarangs.
Yeah. And what it was is that, the comics looked at pulp fiction and said, what do we see that works that we can bring for our characters? I mean, everybody knew it at the time. It wouldn't be like today where people are saying, oh, we've copyrighted Fortress of Solitude or trademarked it, you can't have it. It was just done and people knew it happened. But not only in that, I think that what Doc really influenced the generation of the golden era comics is that he was a character that kids could look up to. I mean, as good as you think Superman is, Doc Savage was that good. He was a good man. He helped the downtrodden. He helped the poor. He, the underdog is the people that Doc worked for. He lived in the city, much like Batman, and and was primarily helping people in the area, but he let all over the world that he would have his adventures. So the comics just took bits and pieces of Doc and said, what's worked and what can we take from that and make it work for our characters, which is okay. I mean, that's how each generation of fiction does.
Yeah. And then if you go into like your first encounter with Doc, like how did that kind of come to be, where obviously in over 25 years, that's a lot of passion for a single thing. And most people don't have that kind of passion. And so do you remember the first time you saw a Doc book?
Sure. And it was a lot more than 25 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Doc Savage was reprinted. The magazines were reprinted in the 60s, and I can tell you more about that later if you're interested. But in the 60s, they put them into paperbacks. And as a kid, I found a paperback book in my closet. I cannot tell you how it got there. Nobody in my family remembered buying it. Nobody knew where it came from. It was there. I read it. I loved it. It was an adventure set in an earlier time. That was obvious. The cars were different. They didn't have the same sort of life I had, and it was only 30 years earlier, but it seemed like a different world for me. And that was a book called The Phantom City, and it was a book, one of Doc Savage's. It wasn't even his first story. It wasn't the origin story or anything. I happened to have a book that was right in the middle. But what really, really attracted me to the series was a book from Philip Jose Farmer, a science fiction writer I'm sure you've heard of.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote Doc Savage's biography. So he took this fictional character and he said, well, let's just take all 181 novels and let's just write the story of Doc Savage. And as a kid, I found this book, which was called Doc Savage, His Apocalyptic Life. And in each page, I was amazed that there were so many stories that I didn't even know about. They had only printed like 20, 25 of these Doc Savage books. And suddenly I was finding out there was 181 of those. And one thing about Doc Savage fans, we tend to be completists. So we have to have them all. So that started my life. I ended up owning a bookstore. I mean, all sorts of things happened because of Doc Savage.
Wow.
So did I love the book? I liked the book. I liked the story. It wasn't the same as reading Raymond Chandler, as or Isaac Asimov or any one of the other authors I was reading at the time. But it was fun and it was easy. And, it was like, like anything else. You occasionally like something that doesn't make you think hard, you can just enjoy. And that's what I loved about the Doc Savage books. And I'm a nerd, so I started collecting them all, and I started keeping stats on everything, on how many pages, like what characters are in each book, all sorts of weird nerdy things. And I did that for a few years.
Well, even going back to the His Apocalyptic Life biography,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they wrote that as if Doc was a real person.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of the behind the scenes part of it, and that itself is just fascinating, that it just breathes life into the character, and also the covers are so eye grabbing and eye catching, and you can't help but go. You can see the influence from this early time of the how science fiction books probably would have been influenced by the James Bond covers. Like he did some Conan covers as well.
I'm going to be the guy that every Doc Savage fan's going to hate, because James Bond was good, but he's not my favorite artist for Doc Savage. There was Bantam had a art director named Len Leone who really wanted a striking cover, and I will give you that. The Doc Savage covers were striking. He made Doc Savage, to me, he asked Bama to make him a little too bulked up, and then the hair that he has on there was something straight out of what the astronauts were looking like at the time. And that that really works for the 60s. And is it the Doc Savage that I saw in my head when I read the books? No, it's not the same guy. As you heard from my brief description earlier, Doc Savage is supposed to sort of blend in, be a little more powerful than the normal guy. But if you saw, I don't know, The Rock walking down the street, he's going to stand out. And I think that the 1960s Doc Savage covers, again, were great. They really sold books. That was what was important. It's not the same as the Doc Savage that I read when I read the Doc Savage novels.
And you mentioned collecting. So is your collection complete?
Oh, yeah, it's been complete for years. Complete again, and complete. At one point, I think I had 3 or 4 sets of the books. And then, of course, I married a woman who was a Doc Savage fan, and she had a couple of sets, including a full set in French. since that's her native language. So yeah, we had quite a few sets of Doc Savage books. It's been republished first in the magazines from 1933 to 1949. Then Bantam republished the books as paperbacks from 64 to 90, 92. And then Sanctum republished them again in the 2000s. So you can buy, if you've got the money, any of the 3 sets of books. It costs you quite a bit to get the pulp magazines, but you can find the Bantams and the Sanctums on eBay and in bookstores, pretty inexpensively. So it won't break the bank if you decide you want to read all these books. And I'll throw something in for the Canadian audience. In Canada, the books are in the public domain, so they're actually online.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. And it's funny, when I started doing my own research and, being fascinated with them, and I went to some used bookstores, they said it is very difficult to find a Doc Savage book because they just hop off the shelf. As soon as they get them, somebody's in there and grabs it right away. And so you have to be there at the right time to get them.
Or you can be on one of my groups, and then we trade with each other and share and help each other find our complete our collections.
And that's where I connected with you, is through the Flea Run group, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But
okay.
What shocked me was just the passion of that group and the people on that group, and how I did the math. I think it's 88 years ago since he was first published, and I know he's kind of had ups and downs, but the passion that the fans of his have and your group members have is amazing. Like, after all this time, daily, they are still talking about somebody that
not
hasn't
only
been
still talking. It's been 25 years of still talking. The group's been around for 25 years now. Started out as a group on Yahoo, back when Yahoo had groups. And even before that, we were on the internet talking in what was called Alt Fan Doc Savage, which was a Usenet group. And you got to be really old to remember those. It's people come and go, but the core groups of people like talking about the minutia of the 181 plus novels. It's never uninteresting to find something as seen by somebody else. You could have a book that you couldn't stand, and there'll be somebody else who wants to tell you it was the best Doc Savage novel written. And it's interesting to talk to each other about that sort of stuff.
Well, like I said, it's just amazing, the passion that this group brings. And I'll definitely share the links to the groups and your websites in the show details. But maybe you could just talk also about going back to the impact that Doc has had on modern day media. When you think about his 5 friends, the Fabulous 5 that helped him out, and the Hidalgo Trading Company, which is one of your website names, is the Hidalgo Trading Company. If you could just kind of talk about the secret base and the Fabulous 5 and
sure.
his world.
Tell you a little bit about. I didn't want to get into too much nerd detail with you, but
that's what we're here for.
Okay, great then. Well, as you just said, and in that little segment I read earlier, Doc had 5 friends. If you believe Philip Jose Farmer, the 6 guys met during World War I in a camp. They were all captured, so they were in a prisoner of war camp. And these men, the 5 aides, are the 5 people that became Doc's closest friends. And whenever he would have an adventure, these guys would jump in and help him. And each one was an expert in his own right in whatever field he was in. You had, one of the world's greatest chemists, who happened to be a guy about 5 foot tall and super strong, called Monk. So you had one of the best lawyers, attorneys, a guy named Ham Brooks. And those 2 characters spent most of the novels arguing with each other. And Doc fans will tell you that that's their favorite part of the novel, and Doc fans will tell you sometimes that's their least favorite part of the novel, is when these two are arguing. There were three other aides, and they were a construction engineer named Rennie Renwick, who was a big, huge guy whose favorite thing to do was to punch through doors with his fist. An electrical engineer named Long Tom Roberts, and Johnny Littlejohn, who was an archaeologist and geologist. And in every book, there would be a reason for one of them to use their expertise. And each time, they knew Doc knew more about that expertise than they did. And that was one of the amazing things, is he's surrounding himself by some of the greatest minds on the planet, but at the same time, they each know he's got their education more than he does. I mean, more than they do. So.
And it's an interesting kind of setup, because the characters that surround him are very lively, and that's where all the character comes. And Doc is kind of stoic and kind of awkward socially a little bit too.
Yeah, if you look at it like he's the hub. He is the guy that's there. He doesn't let others know what necessarily he's thinking. He likes keeping sort of things close to his vest. If you want to play psychology games, you could say that being raised by scientists and not having your mother and father around as a kid made him a little off. You could say that, but at the same time, everybody loves him. All the other aides, everybody literally will risk their life for him. And as a writer, it helps if your major character is not having to carry everything. I mean, all the aides each get their little quirks and whatever throughout the book. And as a reader, you get to see, if you love Monk, you can, look forward to the chapters where Monk is leading. And if you love Johnny, then, you look forward to the chapters where Johnny is doing something. And you don't have to rely on Doc for every bit of it. But at the same time, each one of them knows if it wasn't for Doc, they wouldn't be there. And they all look to Doc to lead. He's the definite leader.
And so
I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it definitely does. And then when you look at kind of how they structure a lot of the stories, and we could talk about Lester Dent, who was the author of many of these, but the whole structure of their Doc has his office space on the 86th floor of what everybody believes to be the Empire State Building, but
not everybody.
Not everybody. Well, it's a significant skyscraper in New York.
Yes. Yes.
And then the Flea Run, which your group is named after, is if you can just describe like what a typical story is.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I laugh about, you ask how can groups of people talk for 25 years on, the same thing over and over and over again. You find that people get into camps. There's the camp who believes. In the books, it never says exactly what's a skyscraper. It gives hints. There's definitely hints that it's the Empire State Building. But then we could discuss for days, in the group about, could it be the Chrysler Building, which is my personal favorite, or some other excuse. And what it is that this man has his office on the top of one of the tallest buildings on Earth at the time in the 30s. Let's say it's the Empire State Building. Everybody knows who Doc Savage is. He's got emblems on his cars so he can run red lights, and cops don't pull him over because everybody loves Doc Savage. Now I'm talking the early years. And usually what happens in a novel, somebody comes to Doc Savage and says, Doc, I'm in trouble. Or Doc, there's this crazy thing happening in my neighborhood or in my city, and you got to help us out. You're the only guy that can do it. Or somebody just tries to bomb his front door and put him out of commission before they try to take over the world. I mean, there's always some big bang start to this. And Doc jumps into the fray. and the aides right with him. It's like tracking down the bad guys, finding out what's going on, and it reads as a mystery adventure for the whole novel. You don't always know who the bad guy is. Sometimes it's right obvious at the beginning. Sometimes there's a person pretending to be a good guy that ends up being the bad guy, and it's these books were really written for the teenager in mind, and but yet they found as they were selling them that people in their 20s and 30s were also loving the books. So they became a little more adult as the years went on. I don't mean adult that way, but it's the idea is this rip roaring adventure that you had each month for a dime. And let's say, okay, you asked about the flea run and the Hidalgo
Yeah.
Trading Company. So he had this headquarters. He also had to have a place for all his ships, airplanes, autogyros, every kind of transportation you could think of. Doc owned, because this man had tons of money. So he had his own gold mine, literally.
Yeah.
And so Doc had to have everything, and he stored it in a warehouse on the Hudson River in New York City. And that warehouse had a tiny little sign on the front of it that just said Hidalgo Trading Company, trying to hide in plain sight, I guess.
Yeah.
And to get from his office to the Hidalgo Trading Company without trying to go through traffic, he created basically a pneumatic tube that would take the guys from the office down the elevator underground and straight to the Hidalgo Trading Company, and that was called the Flea Run.
And there they would get into their jet, gyrocopter,
their submarine, whatever they needed for that story, and planes most often. Doc always had the best planes. He designed them. He had the best submarines. He had the best ships. Whatever it was, Doc had the best. Usually better than the government had at the time. So.
And the types of adventures, and what really kind of piqued my interest was just the occult slash like geopolitical villains slash like it's just a fun group of villains and adventures that he would encounter on his throughout all the novels.
All the James Bond villains that you remember from the movies, Doc had those same kind of villains in his time. Somebody who was wanting to take over the world for whatever reason. It's like to make money, just because they had some sort of reason they wanted to take over the world, just because they were a bad guy who wanted to take over the world. And then there'd be like somebody who just wanted to run a scam, just trying to make money. And, there'd be that one month. So somebody trying to corner. And
vampires.
And there's where, you get the fans of Scooby-Doo, because sometimes the goblins and the vampires were just a guy in a mask. So, so Doc tried to thread, the needle between that being a cult at times, but not really. They tried really to give a scientific explanation for most of what they did.
And the one villain who's the only recurring villain that he's ever had was John Sunlight.
Yes, John Sunlight was in 2 novels, probably intended to be in 3, but was in 2. And John Sunlight was a guy who wore all of one color at a time. So if he was wearing purple, everything was purple. If he was wearing yellow, it was all yellow. And John stumbled on Doc's Fortress of Solitude that I mentioned earlier, and got his way into the Fortress of Solitude and found the weapons that Doc had designed that were too dangerous to be let out for mankind. And that's how we were introduced to John Sunlight. John Sunlight steals some of Doc's weapons and then goes out to conquer the world.
And even
I don't want to give too much away because you got to read those books.
Yeah, cliffhangers, right? Yeah. But and it's almost like I couldn't help but kind of feel like it's a bit of a like Magneto versus Professor X and X-Men. They both had the same goals theoretically, but John Sunlight's approach is more authoritarian and making people do things, whereas Doc had a more holistic way of trying to help the world.
Yeah, Doc, Doc felt, I can't say Doc felt because you never learned how Doc felt on pretty much anything. But in the way Doc acted is that, he looked at people as being inherently good, and maybe some of them have had some wrong troubles. I don't know if we should bring up the crime college because that's always controversial, but Doc felt that for the most part, humans are good, and John Sunlight, for the most part, thought humans needed to be led. I guess that's the best way to put it.
And his crime college, that was like a reform school for criminals that he had incarcerated,
yes.
Essentially.
It was worse than that. The gist of it was that in the late 20s, a doctor out in California had done a study and claimed that almost all criminals had something wrong with their brain. There was a gland or something that was wrong, and if you fix that, they wouldn't be criminals. And in some way, somehow, Lester Dent decided to bring that as part of the stories. And for a good while, when Doc would capture, because remember now, Doc did not kill his enemies. He did not carry a gun. He did not shoot them. He did not blow them up. He wanted to capture them, send them to his hospital called the Crime College, where he would do an operation on the criminal and remove the criminal part of his brain, and then retrain the person to have a good life. That's a very, very controversial part of the books, as you may guess.
In today's world,
society, yes. Yeah. But it was rooted in the science of the time, and that's what we have to look at. Is in the early 30s, this is what people believed. I mean, the man who did the study testified in front of Congress, for God's sake.
And you mentioned Lester Dent, and so a lot of the books are written by Kenneth Robinson, but that's Lester Dent, correct?
Yeah, the Street and Smith looked at the character as being team written. In the early days, the publisher Henry Ralston, the editor John Nanovic, and Lester Dent would sit down. Ralston would throw out some plot ideas. Nanovic would have some. Dent would have some. They'd hash out which ones they thought would sell, which ones they thought that Lester could write. Lester would put together an outline, send it to John Nanovic. John would, suggest things, and Lester would go off and write. They also hired a few other writers. So Lester was trying to do a book a month, and occasionally he wanted to go out adventuring. So they would, he'd either write 3 in a month, so he'd have a couple of months off, or he would hire some other ghostwriters to help put some novels up to give him some breaks. But for the most part, these things were a team effort. I mean, Lester Dent did most of the writing. I think he wrote probably almost 140 of the 181 novels. And then other writers wrote the rest. And I think that it really needs to look at that this was Street and Smith's toy. This is their, they really wanted this character to do well. So, it wasn't like, nowadays Stephen King writes a book, you either publish it or you don't. He's got that kind of power. With Lester, it was, we like you doing this, Lester, but if you don't get it in on time, we're gonna have to get somebody else to get one. It's we need to get this thing out month after month after month. And all that aside, Lester Dent created the majority of what we think of when we think of Doc Savage. I mean, a lot of the tropes and the villains and the stuff, those were Lester Dent creations. So again, I'm not sure I answered your question on that.
No, that's great. Just to kind of see like his influence. And correct me if I'm wrong, there was a fundraiser to have a bridge named after Lester recently by the group.
Yeah, what happened is that Lester was from a town, La Plata, Missouri, and he had went back home and lived there while he was writing these books. I mean, he had come to New York City for a while and wrote while he was there. But, he really, I think he liked Missouri, and he wanted to live in this small town that he had grown up in or had lived in. And in the 30s, they had built a bridge over for the railroad and for the cars, and Lester helped raise funds for that, by going out and doing talks about how he had been adventuring himself. I mean, one of the things to remember about Lester Dent, he was writing what he knew. He had a boat and he would go out hunting for gold. He would go out exploring. He was a man who wanted to, not be stuck in an office in a city. This wasn't a guy who just hunched over a typewriter all day long. So Lester had helped build that bridge in the 30s, and it needed to be replaced. And once the state of Missouri decided they wanted to replace it, a bunch of people got together from the Flea Run and from the town of La Plata and said, let's raise funds and ask the state to call this the Lester Dent Bridge. It's not official yet because of COVID. They've had to delay a lot of work and meetings on deciding, but it's pretty decided that it's going to be the Lester Dent Bridge. I mean, the town is very still. I mean, Lester Dent passed away in 1959, and the town is still proud of the guy who put them, who was their neighbor, who was the man who had the gadget house. Most of them remember. So yeah.
That's great. It just shows that level of community and commitment by the group that you've put together. And, I guess before we close, I just got to ask you, do you have anything in particular, like a story that you go, this to me symbolizes Doc? This is like, for James Bond, some people might think it's Goldfinger or whatever. Is there something that if you could give advice to somebody besides visiting your groups or your website, is there like a great place to start?
You got to start at the beginning. I mean, if you're going to start reading these books, you've got to start at the beginning. But the problem is that the first two books are so different from the later books because they started out Doc being kind of violent. He was very upset because in the beginning of I'm not giving anything away here, but in the beginning of the first book, his dad has died, and Doc sort of loses it a little bit. So I would say read 3 books, the first 3 books in the series, and you can go to any Doc Savage site and find out what those are. The first one's called The Man of Bronze, again. So you can find that. One of my favorites is one that's much later in the series, and I would never tell anybody to start with that one because that doesn't give us good an idea of who Doc is, but it's actually written by someone who doesn't normally write the books. It's written by Lester Dent, but it is from the viewpoint of a person who's not one of the aides or Doc, and sort of caught up in the series. And that's called No Light to Die By. But start with The Man of Bronze.
Okay, good advice. And the long rumored and on again, off again movie, do you think that potential, I mean, maybe you can give us some background on that, but do you think that eventually, if something ever happened like that, could bring Doc to the masses?
There was a Doc Savage movie in 1975.
Well, I think most people like to skip over that one, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And it was created campy, and it didn't do well, to be honest. The campy era had passed. It came just 5 years before Indiana Jones would be so successful. And Indiana Jones is basically a lot like Doc Savage. So if you see Indiana Jones and you like him, you'll like the Doc Savage books. Another movie was proposed starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he decided to run for governor instead. Another movie was just recently proposed for with Dwayne Johnson as Doc Savage. There's some it's what do they call it? Development hell, because from what I understand, the director wants to set it in the 30s. The studio wants it set modern day. I'm going to tell you a not popular opinion is that I hope they don't make a movie. I don't think Doc Savage is, for today's audience, the best character for a movie. They'll want to try and do the origin because most people don't know him, and it's going to be tough to sell that. I think Doc Savage would make a better series on Netflix,
Mm-hmm.
lost all their Marvel characters, who should now go ahead and get some pulp characters and do a series with pulp characters. I think it would do very well that way. Something to give people a chance to get into it.
And the rights holders are Condé Nast, correct? And
Yeah.
that's Vogue magazine and the New Yorker. And do you think they, without getting into trouble or condemning them, do you think they're the right people to handle somebody like Doc Savage, or they've kind of left things to just kind of go about their business?
Well,
correct?
you know, the magazine world is in free fall. I mean, people are not buying magazines as much as they used to, and I am sure Condé Nast has a lot of things that are more important on their plate of trying to keep their all their other magazines healthy. Do they know what to do with the character? Well, it's their character. They can actually do pretty much what they want with it. They had allowed a writer, Will Murray, to write some novels in the early 2000s, and then they decided that they were going to stop. They pulled back any sort of new novels coming out. They had a publisher who was putting out the reprints. They stopped that, and they sort of brought everything back in house. What they're doing with the character, well, they sure as the world were not going to tell me. So I don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're just waiting, thinking that at some point the movie might get made, or maybe there's something else going on that they just haven't shared. My personal opinion is I'd rather not see a movie. I'd rather see a series if I had to pick from the two.
Yeah, that makes more sense to get it more involved and in depth with the characters, and have a more frequent touch point, I guess, for people learning about them.
And I think it's also one of those characters. It's not like with the Marvel books, even when they did Iron Man, they weren't sure that was going to work, the first one. But the characters are all better known. I mean, you're trying to do a character that, let's face it, for the majority of fans, they're well into their 60s now. And you haven't heard much from the character since 75. So it's going to be a big sell to try to get people to know who this character is,
And going back to like the John Carter fail that Disney had, I believe that was Disney.
Yes, that was.
That would be a potential risk similar to that, correct?
Yeah, and what happened was I think it was a decent movie. I had my daughter was young at the time, saw it, thought it was great. The problem was that everybody who was in the normal ticket buying public, they saw John Carter and said, well, wait a minute, this looks like this or this looks like that. They didn't realize that John Carter was what all those other characters were based on. They just thought that this character who they'd never heard of was just ripping off other comics. So I think Doc Savage would have the same sort of problem, and it's just a hard sell to have something that today people don't necessarily want to watch movies that are about characters in the 60s or 30s. I mean, the 30s, let alone the 60s. So, but yeah, it's just a hard sell. So yeah. Well, I don't blame Condé Nast for not rushing in to make the movie.
Well, don't tell me that. I'm designing a role-playing game that's set in that era.
Now you're a completely different audience. Okay, so it's what I'm talking about is like the general public. I'm sure that your game, you're not going to go out and try to get the kids that are playing, the Dungeons and Dragons might be the ones who would go for this, but the kids who are playing, the latest war game. It shows you how out of touch I am. I can't even tell you what the latest shoot 'em up war game is.
Yeah, like it's a Fortnite or something like that.
Yeah, Fortnite. That's one. It's like it's a different audience. If you don't mind not having a huge Marvel, universe blockbuster, if you want something that's smaller than that, Doc Savage will work. Yeah. If you want to, the 30s are an amazing time, and obviously somebody who spent most of his life dealing with characters from the 30s, not just Doc Savage. It's like everything about it is interesting, but you have this huge sell that you have to make to get the general public into it before they will.
Yeah, and I agree. The more I delve into it in my own research, just between tramp steamers and float planes, and like we were talking about earlier, like the gadgets, and at that, it's a very, very interesting time, and there's still kind of lost civilizations to discover.
Right. And that we forgot to mention that earlier. That's also one of the Doc Savage novels. Many of the novels are Doc discovers a lost civilization somehow, or a lost civilization appears somewhere, and Doc goes and investigates it. Things that in our cynical world we think, oh, there's nowhere that we haven't seen on Earth,
Yeah.
and that's a big thing about Doc Savage. The world is not as cynical in the books that you read there.
And maybe you can answer this. Who came up with Skull Island first, King Kong or Doc Savage?
Yeah, I'll probably say King Kong.
Oh, okay. Like you said before, everybody is kind of riffing on each other and just kind
Yeah,
of.
well, some of these things, it's like they're reading the same books, and a lot of time, some of the people that do research on Doc Savage, they go back and find the books that Lester Dent was reading and seeing where did he get some of his ideas. He's got his papers were donated to a college in Missouri, and people go there and read all the manuscripts and read the notes and read the outlines and try to figure out, well, where did he get this crazy idea? So it's as with every sort of writer, there's one part creativity and one part research. I mean,
Yeah.
like you're doing with your game. So it's a big part of your creativity, but it's also research and knowing the characters and the locales well enough.
Yeah, well, definitely. And I've just found him fascinating, and our discussion today fascinating. And before we leave, let's just go over where people can learn more. So docsavage.org, correct?
Yes, that's where the Hidalgo Trading Company is. That was the first one I did 25 years ago. And then if they're on Facebook, which most everybody is now, they can go to facebook.com/groups/flea run. So FLEARUN, and join the group there. It gets very nerdy at times, but they're welcome just to sit back and listen if they just want to learn more about it. I also do the magazine, which is at bronzegazette.com with Terry and Kez. I want to throw a couple of other ones in if I can.
Well,
They're not mine.
Well, let's say also remind people that they can subscribe to this year's Bronze Gazette, which is 3 issues for 2021. Yes. And so
2021.
So you can subscribe there.
Yeah, we've been going for 30 years. Well, not us. There was another editor who started it in 1990, but Bronze Gazette's been going for 30 years. If you want to talk about how long Doc Savage fandom has lasted.
And they can get back issues there as well.
Yeah, some of them are still available. The ones that Terry, Kez, and I have done are definitely available, which is like the last 15. Speaking of Kez, his artwork, if you have any sort of interest in any sort of character that's in comics, movies, Kez has done a fantasy cover of Doc and that character. And he's a great artist and does a really good work. And he does that at docfantasycovers.com. And there's 2 more sites, if you don't mind me plugging here. There is a man named Tom Barnett, who is probably one of the top Doc Savage researchers. He's got a site called bronzeicon.com. And one of the very first Doc Savage sites was by a man named Chris Kalb. And his is at heropulp.com/the 86th floor. And you can find him more Doc Savage art there. I hope somewhere you'll be able to put this down because it's easier to
I'll make sure
find him without my voice, right?
I'll make sure all the links are in the notes.
Okay.
And I'll put them on our website. But also the Bronze Conversation.
Yes, the Bronze Conversation is something that we announce on the Flea Run right now, since it's all done by Zoom. So we get together on Zoom. We watch we watch a fan edit of the 1975 movie that actually makes the movie fun and interesting, which we have done. We talk about the characters face to face. We started going online right after, well, it's been a year now, right after COVID started making us all stay at home. So it's a way just to, I don't know, you're stuck in your house all day long. It's a way to see other people. And someday when we can all move around again, we'll probably go back to La Plata and meet together there and talk about the books and talk about the characters and argue whether it was the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building or any other kind of little arguments that we can do, because if fans do nothing else, they can argue about minutia.
Yeah.
So, but it's fun. It's rarely do we come to blows. I mean, rarely, very rarely.
Well, I certainly appreciate you joining me today. You've enlightened me, and I appreciate the work that you've done keeping Doc in the spotlight and educating people on the history of Doc and the Fabulous Five. And I just want to say thank you once again for joining me today.
Thank you for letting me ramble on a Friday afternoon.
Thanks.
Thanks.